So good morning, Stephen, first and foremost, and a tremendous appreciation for making the time to prepare for this session and also just to make an input into the massive open online course that the African Centre for Cities is developing. May I ask you just to introduce yourself, tell us who you are, where you're located, and your research interests.
Yes, it's my pleasure to be here. I am Stephen Devereux. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK, where I'm a director of the Centre for Social Protection. And I also hold the Saatchi Research Chair in Social Protection for Food Security at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa.
Great, thank you. So you're definitely well positioned to respond to the questions that we have for you this morning. So Stephen, we are discussing the topic of social protection. And I guess a good starting point would be to help me understand what are we talking of when we speak about social protection?
Yes, social protection is usually seen as a set of policy instruments that protect people against shocks and risks, and also tries to lift people out of extreme poverty. So normally we divide social protection into social assistance and social insurance. Social assistance includes cash transfers, school feeding programs, food aid, disability grants, public works programs, and they usually target the poor and very often people that aren't working. Whereas social insurance includes pension funds, unemployment insurance, maternity leave, health insurance, and often that targets people who are working and have access to employment-related social protection. So you're paying into some kind of fund and you then get a pension or unemployment insurance if you lose your job. That's a basic distinction between the two main components of social assistance and social insurance.
Okay, so you know that we're focusing very much on the urban. Is there a difference between a social protection that's developed for an urban context versus a rural context?
Yes, that's an interesting question because especially in Africa, social protection often started in rural areas as a response to food insecurity and hunger. For example, one of the biggest programs in Africa is the Productive Safety Net program in Ethiopia, which reaches 8 or 9 million people every year and tries to build farmers' resilience against drought and famine. So the PSNP was actually launched in rural areas of Ethiopia in 2005, and it only started extending into the towns and cities in 2017, and it's still much smaller in urban areas than in rural areas. And I guess the reason is that the perception is that rural needs are bigger, that people in urban areas have less need for social protection, and I personally would disagree with that. But other programs are more national and have coverage across both urban and rural areas. For example, the Child Support Grant in South Africa reaches 12 million poor children across the country, both in urban and rural areas.
Okay, so Stephen, can I ask you to tell me if you think there is a difference in the needs between the urban social protection and the rural space? Are the needs of the urban citizen different to those of the rural resident?
Definitely they're different, and I think this is one thing that we don't understand well enough when designing and implementing social protection programs. For one thing, if you think about urban living versus rural living, the costs of living in urban areas are much higher than in rural areas. So in villages, you'll find that housing, water, energy, they're all free. You don't have to pay for any of those. And people grow their own food, so they don't have to buy a lot of food at shops. So their costs are much lower. But in towns and cities, people have to pay rent for their housing. They often have to pay for water and electricity. They have to buy food. How can they afford to pay for all these expenses if they're unemployed or even if they're low income workers?
Okay, so
and of course, it's even more difficult for poor people now with the cost of living crisis and food prices spiking. So we could say that the urban poor should be given more social assistance than the rural poor. Even if the amount of cash transfers can't be adjusted, because that would be seen as discriminating against rural people, maybe the urban poor should be given subsidized or free water, electricity, rent, and transport. And this is actually what happened during COVID-19, when many governments suspended utility bills so that people trapped at home during lockdown didn't at least have to pay for basic utilities.
Okay, no, thanks for that. So I heard quite a few things there, Stephen. One, the fact that this is definitely understudied, so there needs to be more research dedicated to understanding the nuance and the difference between these contexts. And then definitely a need to sort of make the social protection very contextually appropriate to these different needs within a rural and urban context. But I want to pick up on the last point that you made relating to COVID-19. What social protection lessons were derived from the pandemic? And I'd like you to focus specifically on urban social protection.
Well, firstly, we could say that social protection was one big winner from COVID-19 because governments across the world realized that social protection could be leveraged or used as part of the COVID-19 response, and most governments did so. For example, if you have a cash transfer payment through an electronic mechanism like mobile money or through mobile phones, it's very simple to increase the amount of money that's transferred to people. And that's called vertical expansion. In urban Ethiopia, for example, a top-up was paid to people receiving cash transfers during the lockdown period. And that was used specifically in urban areas. It's also relatively straightforward to add new beneficiaries to existing programs using the same registration and payment systems. This is called horizontal expansion, and it saves time setting up new programs and new systems in the middle of a crisis like COVID-19. So many governments across Africa did this in 2020. For example, in South Africa, a special social relief of distress grant was introduced to deal with COVID-19, which supported urban workers who were unable to work because of the lockdown and therefore had no way of surviving. And this new program was set up and people were registered online and they got their payments through their mobile phones. And I think the biggest lesson really for urban social protection is this big gap that we have in coverage for urban informal workers, and specifically women. Because if you think about social assistance, it usually targets children, older people, people with disabilities, in other words, the non-working poor. If you think about social insurance, it targets people who have formal employment and then can pay into their pension funds or their unemployment insurance, and then they get a payout when they need it. But the urban informal workers are not covered. They are left out. So that gap for working age population, the urban poor, do not have access to any type of social protection, either social assistance or social insurance. So a big lesson from COVID-19 was to extend coverage to that group, which is highly vulnerable and is left out at the moment of most social protection systems, not just in Africa, actually, but across the world.
Thank you, Stephen. So I think one of the pushbacks, especially from African governments, really centers on the cost of availing social protection. But I think from that last example you've provided just about the leveraging of social protection during the pandemic crisis, it really speaks to, I think, opportunities that may not have been empirically sort of backed up. So can you speak to some of the opportunities and then also counterbalanced with the challenges that lie ahead for social protection in the next few years?
Well, firstly, I think we have to make the point that social protection is not wasteful expenditure. It's actually an investment and it generates returns. So for example, if you give a cash transfer to a poor person, that person uses that money to buy food, to buy basic services like transport or even hairdressing, whatever they use the money for, is going to generate income for other people. So there have been a number of studies in many African countries that have shown that $1 or 1 shilling or 1 rand of cash that's transferred through a social protection program generates 2 or 3 or more dollars or shillings in return. So there's an economic growth effect from social protection. And that shouldn't be underestimated. And in fact, the opportunity to invest in social protection is greater now that we've had COVID-19, because we know that it's going to protect people and also promote local economic growth. Farmers benefit from higher demand for their food and so on. But I think what we learned from COVID-19 is that there's 2 possible ways forward. One is what you could call the high road, which is expanding social protection towards universal coverage, filling those gaps like urban informal workers. The other option is to take the low road and say, no, government spent far too much on social protection during COVID and in response to the current cost of living crisis, and now they have to cut back and have austerity programs. And that would be wrong. That would be a big mistake. We need to have social protection at the heart of not just shock response, but also building towards the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are coming just 6 or 7 years away. And social protection is in 3 of them. It's in the poverty one, the gender one, and the inequality SDG. So we need the high road. We need to have investments, more investments in social protection, building shock responsive social protection systems that protect everybody against poverty and risks.
Stephen, thank you so much. This has been a really informative and insightful discussion this morning. And I certainly have several takeaways. And I think the key one is really understanding and I guess imparting or communicating this to African government officials, which is the catalytic effect and definitely the economic investment that is the social protection. So thank you very, very much for giving us a really holistic understanding.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.